I'm a citizen of Europe.
Sono cittadina europea.
Ich bin europäischer Bürger.
Jam europeană.
Európai polgár vagyok.
Eu sou europeia.
Jag är en medborgare i Europa.
Ja sam europeanka.
Yo soy ciudadana del continente europeo.
Jestem Europejczykiem.
Sunt europiete. Sunt cetățean al Europei.
Ja graștancă Europei.
Ja româneancă Europei. Sunt europiete.
Moi, je suis un citoyen européen.
Liebe Freunde des European Citizens Radio, wir sitzen heute nicht im Café Aroma, wo wir ja sonst immer die Aufnahmen machen, sondern für heute haben wir uns was Besonderes ausgedacht. Ich sitze in Berlin, allerdings in meiner Wohnung im schönen Schöneberg, und ich bin verbunden heute mit László Andor, der in Budapest sitzt. Und um es noch außergewöhnlicher zu machen, werden wir diese Sendung auf Englisch machen und nicht auf Deutsch. Das hat folgenden Sinn: Wir wollen das European Citizens Radio natürlich auch für andere Europäer zugänglich machen. Bisher hatten wir ja 5 Folgen nur auf Deutsch, aber jetzt haben wir gedacht, ist mal Zeit für Englisch. Und nicht nur das, wir toppen auch noch das Englische. Das heißt, ich werde erst mit László Andor auf Englisch sprechen und er wird mir als Ungar auf Englisch antworten. Aber danach mache ich die gleiche Sendung nochmal, wo ich auf Englisch spreche und er mir auf Ungarisch antworten wird. Das heißt, wir machen heute eine englische und eine ungarische Aufnahme. Warum machen wir das? Wir glauben an Europa, wir glauben an seine Kultur, wir glauben an Umberto Eco. Europa ist Übersetzung. Wir glauben daran, dass wir einander intuitiv verstehen, auch wenn wir die Sprache nicht so richtig können. Und deswegen machen wir das jetzt als Experiment. Und dann haben die Ungarn auch einen Spotify und einen YouTube-Kanal, wo Sie mal so ein bisschen das European Citizens Radio hören können. Und vielleicht finde ich ja einen zweiten Ungarn, mit dem ich das Gleiche nochmal machen kann. Das alles, die Einleitung ist heute ein bisschen länger als Einstieg, weil wir werden so weitermachen. Wir werden danach Aufnahmen machen in Französisch und dann in Englisch, weil das ist die Idee des European Citizens Radio, dass wir nicht in Deutschland bleiben, nicht in Berlin, auch wenn das Café Aroma natürlich ganz toll ist. Aber wir wollen hinaus strahlen, hinaus streamen in allen Sprachen, die Europa zu bieten hat. This is why I now switch to English, and now it's the first recording that I do in English with the European Citizens Radio, and now I'm going to present László Andor. László is a very old friend of mine. He's approximately my age. He has been serving as a EU Commissioner for Hungary under the second Barroso Commission until 2014, the EP elections, and actually he was the Commissioner for Social Affairs. And in this position, before he was a professor, he was a professor for political science in Budapest. He was a economic professor, also in Budapest. He had lots of stations in his life. He has been writing a lot of things, stuff about European, social Europe, all over the place. He is member of the Hungarian Social Democratic Party. In this function, he has been engaged in the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, has a sort of European body in Brussels. So this is called FEPS, F-E-P-S. And there László has been engaged over years, writing a lot, publishing a lot. Actually, we did a book 2 years ago. FEPS brought a book, and the title is The Future of Europe. So you will find, for all the listeners who want to Google now László Andor, you will find one of his most recent publications in this FEPS book from 2020, I think. By the way, there's also a contribution from myself. And I invited László because he's one of the most distinguished scholars, professors, but also living experience in social Europe. Because he was a Commissioner for Social Affairs, he was in the European Commission, and he presented in 2014 at the European Council a proposal, for instance, for a European unemployment scheme. So I'm welcoming László to have a broad conversation with him today about what is social Europe, when did it started, what are the reasons, how can we build a social Europe, and I want to ask him about his former experience as a EU Commissioner, but also where do we stand today with the question of social Europe. So László, welcome to this European Citizens Radio today.
Thank you very much for inviting. It's really a pleasure.
Yeah, and for me, it's also, as you can sense, a novelty. So it's the first podcast we are going outside. So we are doing a Berlin-Budapest European Citizens Radio here. And I'm very happy because what will it lead to? What we are going to do is that first we talk in English. I talk English, László will reply in English. But we will do a second sort of recording where I will pose the questions in English and László will reply in Hungarian. Why do we do it? We do this because we want to give a different taste and a different aroma to Europe. We want to animate many, many European citizens to listen to us. And so we thought it would be a very, very nice thing to also do a recording in Hungarian and that the Hungarians can also on Spotify or on YouTube listen to László in Hungarian. And this is what we call Europe's Babel because, Europe is functioning with many, many, many languages. And we have a couple of translations tools today. So language should no longer be the barrier for European citizens, and that is basically the nice try we are going to do today. So, László, but perhaps you can introduce you a little bit more. I said you were Socialist Party, Social Democratic Party from Hungary. I already said that you are at the European Commission, but perhaps you have some more things to say about you.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. Indeed, I come from Hungary and originally I was trained as an economist, but economics for me has always been embedded in social science, in a way, political economy. So at the beginning of my teaching career, I was actually attached to a political science department and then I switched to economic policy. But indeed, I was also interested in the practice and not only in the teaching. And I was for 5 years a board member for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London, which was basically economic diplomacy, from which I transferred to the European Commission in 2010, focusing indeed on employment and social policies at a time of a major crisis. I think we will discuss this later, how big crisis this was for the European Union, what we could do at that time, and what ideas we developed in the meantime.
Yeah, so thank you for this presentation. So our listeners have now understood that we have the perfect guest for the most important topic, which is social Europe. László, when we had this big crisis, we are talking about the banking crisis, which turned into a euro crisis. We are talking about a very dark moment in European history where we had a lot of confrontations between the northern countries and the southern countries, between austerity claims and loud yelling against transfer union, and a lot of grievances between European citizens. Yeah, there were the lazy Greeks and the hardworking Germans and so on and so forth. And in this crisis, where we discovered that we have a lot of social stress among citizens in Europe, you came up with an idea, a European unemployment scheme. Can you perhaps just shape us or present us a little bit by then? What was the idea and why you came up with it?
Well, this is very kind of you to highlight this, I would say, vision. Because indeed, when I launched the discussion more or less in 2012 about the necessity of developing automatic stabilizers and most importantly, some form of unemployment insurance at the level of the European Union, very few people liked the idea, and I should even say that very few people demanded it. So basically, there was no demandeur, as they would say in Brussels, for this policy innovation. But the European institutions were really desperate to find the right policy orientation and the right tools to calm the financial markets and also to give reassurance to the European citizens that the EU is not part of the problem. The EU is the solution. And I must say that for several years, some of the EU policies, indeed, we have to be honest, were actually part of the problem and helped deepening the crisis, financial, but also a social crisis, to some extent also a political crisis. Losing trust, losing confidence in the EU institutions was measurable. So we needed tools, instruments to launch launch a positive cycle. And I think this proposal, which addressed, on the one hand, the financial side, the financial architecture, but also the social dimension of the EU, appeared as a very pertinent one.
Yes, I remember quite well that in these days, let's face it, we had the use of the southern countries with Stefan Issel, Empört euch, indignez-vous. We had flags of the European Union being burned at the 10 years birthday of the ECB in Frankfurt. We had much of Spanish youngsters leaving basically Spain for unemployment reasons. And there was a huge discussion coming up from banking, when we went from banking crisis to euro crisis and all these distortions within the Eurozone, about helping the southern countries. I remember, and perhaps this is interesting for our listeners, there were a German professor for political science, Sebastian Dulin, who worked heavily on papers at Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, for those who want to follow up on this podcast and instruct themselves a little bit. Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. Sebastian Dulin wrote a couple of papers basically inventing schemes of unemployment which should have helped the European youth. And I want to basically drag a little bit deeper into this, but you picked up these plans. You worked together, if I'm not mistaken, with people like Jean Pisani-Ferry from the French side, or with Hendrik Enderlein, who by then was working for the German Minister of Economy, Sigmar Gabriel, and you tried to basically put a social pillar into the treaties or the contracts of the European Union. Is this right? I remember that there were votings at the level of the European Council where you tried to basically cope with the economic and social distortions, and you tried to open such a scheme at the European level. Perhaps you can describe a little bit how you did this.
Yes, you listed so many names, and indeed I would like to recall maybe even more, but it's absolutely important indeed to highlight the role of Sebastian Dulin, who was the first economist developing a very detailed outline of a European unemployment benefit scheme, published subsequently with the Bertelsmann Stiftung. And he was invited to background discussions in the European Commission to discuss stabilizers together with the French economist Jacques Delplat and also a Greek social scientist Manos Matsaganis. And then subsequently, further economists started to join this investigation. And indeed, Hendrik Enderlein, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, was one of those. Matthias Dolz from Mannheim at that time, who moved then to Munich. It's very interesting that sometimes this is called an instrument which Germany would never accept, but ironically, quite a few German economists have been working on this one way or another. Maybe they understood earlier than others that sooner or later the Economic and Monetary Union would only be sustainable economically, but also socially, if these types of stabilizers enter the picture, and they went ahead with the analysis, political analysis also, and legal one. And on the legal side, René Repassi has to be highlighted as a professor of law recently in Rotterdam, and now he just became a member of the European Parliament.
Okay. I didn't know that René Repassi, in the meantime, is in the European Parliament. But he's a member. Let me pick up on two things. As a German, you said rightly that there were a lot of German economists involved in shaping European unemployment scheme. When I talk about this and social Europe and what social Europe could mean in Germany, most of the questions in the audience I get is, but you cannot harmonize social treatments. This would cost Germany too much. This is one of the most heard, argument when you are talking about it. Do you want to lift everybody up to the German level of social treatment? Yeah. So that is one question, because I want you to answer whether this idea of a European unemployment scheme. In my understanding, the idea has never been to lift social treatment up to the German level. The idea has much more been to stabilize it on a several level in crisis time, beyond the structural, to leave the structural unemployment where it is, but to stabilize the conjunction of the flaws when there is a crisis. Yeah. So this is the question I give to you. What do I answer my German citizen fellows when they are afraid that such thinking would lead to overpayment of Germany?
Yes, I think Germans were not alone with being so hesitant and always double checking whether a new EU policy would lead to more transfers or permanent transfers or moral hazards. So from this point of view, indeed, there's been a lot of impediment to this process, not only the policy making, but also sometimes the discussions. But what I would say is that in all areas, wherever the new EU policy is introduced, some degree of harmonization takes place, which is necessary for the various national systems to communicate with each other. But it's never the case that a European intervention directly would lead to a complete equalization. So very often the minimum levels are harmonized, and this is the important point here, that below a certain floor, the treatment of the unemployed people cannot fall. And this is the same case with the treatment of the employed people. For example, the Working Time Directive or other EU directives in the world of work defines certain minima, and then of course, countries can always do better. Maternity leave, also, the EU directive determines a certain minimum, and then, of course, countries which want to perform better can indeed do better. But then you have to ask the question, what happens if the EU doesn't provide this kind of safety net for the unemployment benefit systems? And that what happens is that the weaker countries, deficit countries, somehow feel that they are forced to reduce the generosity of the unemployment benefit provision. There will be, in a crisis period, more and more unemployed, but if the generosity is cut, there will be more and more impoverished. But since in the European Union we have the free movement of people, it means that a phenomenon develops which German people 10 years ago started to call Armutszuwanderung, that the poverty starts to migrate. I don't think it's a nice expression, but that's how it was perceived, that people who are desperate because they can't find a job at home, number one, but number two, the welfare system of their home country cannot support them anymore because of the fiscal pressures of the monetary union. So the consequence, the repercussion of this phenomenon is something which would be even more negative for the citizens of the countries which are doing better. So that's why it's much more logical to collectively stabilize the social safety nets at a minimum level, to agree that below a certain point it cannot fall even if there is a crisis, and then we will eventually have a much more stable system economically, because it also maintains the demand, purchasing power in the economies of the adjusting countries, but also socially, because you will not experience a type of migration which a lot of people would not welcome.
I just indicate to our listeners that László and also myself, we have widely or extensively published on this in a book published by FEPS, which is the Friedrich Ebert Foundation's office in Brussels, and it's called The Future of Europe. And the book is out since, I think, 2 years or so now.
Yes,
and
exactly.
It's on the market. So if you want to deepen this, because I am still convinced, and I think László is so too, that the question on social Europe will basically be haunting us for quite a while, and we will need to fix these things. Also, because I chime in with the results of the conference on the future of the European Union. The European Commission recently has do a huge consultation and interviewed something like 300,000 citizens of Europe, invited them to Citizens' Assembly, and basically wanted to ask what European citizens today want from Europe. And there were three topics really coming out, which is first social Europe and everything that is accompanying social Europe. The second was climate environment, sort of green policies. And the third was health policies. Probably this was under the impact of the COVID crisis. So, but these are the three topics. Now, my question to László Andor is first, what do you make out of these results? Because if we look at these 49 recommendations, which the citizens of Europe basically have given to the European Commission to make something like progress on the citizens level for Europe, there's a first thing, what do we make with these conclusions that the citizens have now come up with? But in historical perspective, we need, and I just want to, to comment you on where have we been and what do we want today. Where we have been is the situation of the banking crisis, where we wanted to do all these things, and we failed in a way, because the moment you were talking about 2014, the European unemployment scheme did not go through the Council. The social Europe by then was basically scattered, did not take place. And if you remember, we had the genuine economic and monetary union ambitions, which were publicized or published in 2012 and then renewed in 2015. We wanted this economic union, political union, fiscal union, and none of this took place. So all the plans of genuine economic and monetary union, GMEO, did not take place. Now we are basically 10 years later, 2014, 2023, it's 9 years later. And now we have the Citizens' Conference coming up with these demands. So how do you, also in the perspective of the history, where do we come from and what do we want today, how do you see things developing in the pillar of social Europe?
First of all, let me stress that I very much agree with you that this conference on the future of Europe, with the involvement of citizens directly, was a very interesting and important exercise. My organization, the FEPS, under the leadership of our president, Maria João Rodrigues, was indeed working a lot and contributing a lot. Of course, it's true that not all the policies of the EU can be worked out in this kind of direct engagement of randomly selected citizens, but it gives an important feedback. And I think the feedback is that wherever the citizens come from, they have a strong attachment to what we call the European social model. Maybe not everybody calls it a European social model, but the need for strong social solidarity, the need for equality, the need for decent social dialogue, and the role for civil society. I think Europeans value all these principles. They want to live in a society which upholds all these principles. And in different times, different aspects of this European social model are emphasized more. At the time of the pandemic, as you just said, indeed, the need for the EU to do more for healthcare standards and healthcare capacities, perhaps even coordination, some funding, obviously appears. Previously did not appear much. But 10 years ago, when we had the unemployment crisis, of course, the expectation from the citizens was, without a conference like this, that the EU should do more to solve the crisis of employment. And then we had a good run with schemes like the Youth Guarantee, for example. And this expression still resonates in many places, not only inside Europe, but also outside. So the EU can always do more to strengthen its social dimension. I think it's a correct observation, which a lot of social scientists, including in Germany, start with, that the social integration of Europe is always lagging behind the economic one. But if you ask the citizens whether it is important or not, I think the citizens will insist that it's as important as the economic one, and the time lag should be minimized, should be closed, and then we should somehow ensure that we catch up with the financial and economic integration in the area of the social policy coordination as well.
Do you think that there's enough energy in the system to do this? I'm just reminding that in 2018 we had the social summit in Göteborg. So the EU was launching a big third, social pillar in Göteborg, which is basically 5 years ago, 2018. But now let's look at what happened since ever then. We had the pandemic, we had the 750 billion rescue package, the Next Generation EU program, with a lot of money spent, and we had a lot of money spent on vaccination, vaccine policies, and so on and so forth. So the real question is, do we have, because the European Union went through two major crises. One crisis was the COVID crisis. The second crisis is the war. The Europe is not engaged, not directly engaged, but obviously the war in Ukraine is also a big sort of momentum where money is spent for armament. Where is the social question in these two discussions? Because I think you are right in saying the social pillar is lagging behind all ambitions of political union in other topics. But my real question is, where's the discussion on social Europe right now? Because on the observation side, I would rather argue that we see more or less devastated societies. I mean, the COVID crisis had an impact on many societies. There is in Germany social, I would say, I wouldn't call it regression, but we have inflation coming, we have more poverty. Germany is not alone in this. The same is true for France, it's true for Italy. So the social question is somewhere not around. On the other hand, a lot of money has been spent for other things like COVID policies or weapons. So where do you see closing the link?
Yes, we can compare these three crises, right? 10 years ago, the Euro crisis, 3 years ago, the pandemic, and now the impact of the war. And probably the best performance was observed at the time of the pandemic. I think what you highlighted, the so-called Next Generation EU financial framework, which topped up the conventional EU budget by about 80%. So the EU budget almost doubled, and it has mainly done for financial solidarity and material solidarity with countries where GDP was falling and unemployment was rising. And this was really a novelty, a new approach, delivering very concrete solidarity. And it was not only the Next Gen EU, but even before, the EU came forward with an instrument they called SURE, and that actually elevated to the EU level what the Germans call the Kurzarbeit. And not with small money, but 100 billion euros loan scheme, and that has been fully used. So this really has been, I would say, a big turnaround, and also created a favorable environment to deliver further pioneering initiatives like, for example, the EU directive on coordinating adequate minimum wages. This is also something which people just a few years before would have thought this is impossible, or some would have questions whether it is necessary or not. But 10 years before, even in Germany, people questions whether a minimum wage inside Germany is necessary or not. So first it was delivered inside Germany in 2015, and then it was possible to promote this at EU level. And it's not only about discussing a certain level of the minimum wage, but also promoting the social dialogue and collective bargaining in various countries. So it has an impact. It will have an impact. Now, we come to the third crisis, which is the the war and the effects of the war and the economic warfare which has developed around it. I think the jury is still out to what extent the social consequences of this can be tamed or not, because I think 1 year ago the first reaction of the Europeans was simply to demonstrate maximum solidarity with the country that was under attack, which is Ukraine, which is still under attack. At the same time, there was a developing understanding that if this war lasts long, and secondly, if the consequences, the disruption of economic relations, trade, business investment with Russia, between Eastern Europe and Western Europe in broad terms, then, of course, this is going to reduce the growth potential. It's going to reduce the prosperity of the Europeans, not for a short time, but for a longer time. Mm-hmm. So Europe is facing a Zeitenwende, but the Zeitenwende also means that for the sake of a new paradigm of security, in which the United States is playing, again, a greater role than before, we basically make a sacrifice. And
sacrifice or perhaps damage, I mean, self-damage. I mean, there isn't this critical mass sort of that European is more or less going into self-damaging policies with respect to energy flows, energy provision? I mean, question mark.
Yes, I mean, I think there is a mixture of damage and sacrifice. So to the extent people want to help Ukraine, and if to the extent people want to cut relations from Russia, this is a sacrifice. If people believe that, well, this is perhaps not fully necessary, or some kind of modus vivendi could be found sooner or later, then of course it's involuntary. But I think the problem is that while these fights are continuing, and sometimes there's a cacophonic debate about the causes of the war and the implications and what kind of peace is possible afterwards, it's very hard to see clearly what is possible now or in the coming years in terms of rebuilding the living standards. One thing is for sure, that the cost of living crisis which we experience today, the high inflation, which is unprecedented, at least in this century for most of the Europeans, is largely a consequence of this war. Now, more the war than the post-pandemic situation, because the pandemic also, left behind some delayed effects in terms of price increases and disruption of supply chains internationally. But now, because of the energy price increases, because of the disruption of economic relations, the food price changes, because with Russia and Ukraine dropping out from much of the exports, the food prices also exploded internationally, and people in Europe, but also outside Europe, the so-called global south, feel all the consequences. So we can't see the end. We can't see the end of this. And,
yeah, but let me chime in here. We can't see the end. We have a Zeitenwende, you said. We have a Zeitenwende, yeah, with the two, la guerre contre virus and the other guerre, although Europe was told to be nie wieder Krieg, yeah, but we have a Zeitenwende. I would also agree that there's something fundamentally that has changed in the way we discuss Europe. And this podcast we are doing here, the recording here, is first to contrast what we could discuss, say, 10, 15 years ago, which was social Europe, which was political ambition, which was the ambition about a genuine economic and monetary union. And all these ambitions basically did not materialize after the banking crisis. Now we are still around with this plaidoyer, with this deep wish of social Europe and political union that we can see in the results of the future conference, the citizens' assemblies. So, and what you are saying, there's a Zeitenwende. What you are also saying is that there will be whatever social regression through what is happening in this wartime. So probably the European Union will not be able to match the social expectations of its citizens, and most importantly, will not even try to match the political ambitions any longer. My question to you is, how do you, because you're sitting in Budapest, we hear a lot, we are sitting in Berlin, we hear a lot about Hungary and the awkward Orban and, the populist and whatever, yeah? So we are observing the populist turn in Europe. We are observing the populist term not only in Hungary, it's also Poland and the Peace Party, it's also the FPÖ in Austria, it's also the AfD in Germany, it's also Marine Le Pen, whatever. So if we are saying, and this is what I want you to react, if we are saying that the political but also the social ambition of Europe we once had, which is not materializing, has now produced populism in a variety of EU countries. Yeah, how do we argue against? I mean, if you said just in your last answer, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. What is the discourse that we need to bring light into the tunnel and to go back to an agenda of politically united and social Europe for all?
Well, if you ask me, this is indeed a war without a silver lining, right? The discussion about populism was indeed exploding about 10 years ago. And we saw in the 2014 European Parliament elections, after the great Eurozone crisis, that because the so-called mainstream parties, center-left, center-right, and the liberals, didn't easily find the answers the citizens were looking for, or didn't provide the answers the citizens were looking for in terms of preserving their living standards and safety and security of the everyday life. Then there was a shift towards various types of populist left, but also right. I think what we experience now is mainly shift to the right. So if you look at most of the elections held in national context in the last 1 year, since last April, we saw Hungary, France, Sweden, Italy, but Israel can also be named. The net gains all went to the right, and especially the far right. So and that, of course, would need to be analyzed by political scientists and political analysts, whether it is true that the war is generating an extra dose of nationalist sentiment, or is there a time for militarism, and militarism, contradicts the sentiment of social solidarity, which we would need. So if this whole trade-off between guns and butter is now shifting towards the guns, and everybody wants to produce more weapons, then of course, one way or another, the expectation will be that less will be spent on social services, public services, consumer goods, and that might generate a negative spiral. So if that analysis is sound, then we should really be concerned about the European Parliament elections of next year. Because 1 year from now, we are going to have an election time. And if the citizens do not find enough reference and promise regarding security, but security also in terms of the security of the living standards and the living conditions and the working conditions of the everyday life. Security is not simply about someone else not crossing your border, right? Security also means that you can live a life which you would like to live, and you can raise your children, and you can meet your friends in a decent way, and take care of your elderly.
I just wanted to come to the European Parliament elections, because we are sitting here in May 2023, so the elections are just in 1 year of time. And Europe has been undergoing this Zeitenwende and is not in good shape. I mean, let's face it. We are talking about political ambitions here and about social ambitions. We are discussing, László and I, whether there is still any social and political ambition, because what we saw is there was a lot of ambition to do what I call functional policies, do something on climate, do something on whatever defense, but the institutional ambition to unite European citizens, to have a political vision and to have a social vision, I think this discussion we lost. And the real question is whether we can regain in this discussion. But here's my question, because you say rightly that the elections are in 1 year. We have a lot of talk about, what we call the exit discussions. I mean, there is the Swedish party, which is now calling for, like Brexit, Svexit. Then in Austria, you have a lot of exit discussions. There is Italexit, there is Polexit. I don't know whether the Hungarians are dreaming of Hungarian exit, whatever. Yeah, yes. So there's a lot of exit discussions. And I would simply state as an observation that the European Union is not in good shape and has not enough, in my opinion, convincing arguments to make citizens happy in what you said, because now we are in this trade-off between butter and weapons, as you called it. Maybe the European sort of ambition as such was falling apart in the past 2 or 3 years. So what if we see a new arising of populism all over the European Union? What if we see emerging discussions about, exiting the European Union? Because this is a big fear for me. I remember that in the 2019 elections, there was already a lot of fearfulness that the so-called populists would basically win the elections and have a huge turnaround, a huge turnout. So now, in my opinion, and not only in my opinion, but negative sentiment against the European Union after Eurobarometer data has been rising. So the European Union is no longer in a trustworthy position. There's a lot of resentment and sentiment against the European Union. Do you think we have a chance, or what would be needed actually to go back to a convincing vision that Europe is a solution and not the problem? In Germany, I can tell you, this sort of technostructure of the European Union starts to be a real problem. And although all those people who try to defend the European Union are basically not winning the discussion. The discussion that might be won is a discussion about a different Europe, a different alter Europe, which is a Europe which is social or politically united, a Europe which is for the citizens, in which the citizens can vote, and so on and so forth. So there is a discussion about a different Europe, which we might win, but the sort of defending the EU, I think, is a discussion you can't win in nearly any of the EU countries. So what do we do about it? And perhaps you can say something about Hungary.
Yes. First of all, the various types of exits, right? Brexit indeed was the mother of all exits. But I think in reality, the children will not grow up. In other words, there will be a lot of theatrical talk about Swedish or Hungarian or other types of exit. But once we all saw how much the British actually burned themselves with the Brexit experience, nobody in reality is going to pursue an exit from the European Union. The change in Italy speaks volumes because, 4 or 5 years ago, everybody was really scared that if Salvini forms a government, there would be maybe not an exit from the EU, but exit from the Eurozone, and that's going to be the end of it. And now it's not Salvini, but Meloni who formed the government, and they sidelined all these economic arguments, and I'm not saying that the arguments they are using and all these far-right tropes, they are pretty because they are not. But they are not running a campaign to leave the European Union. Unfortunately, in Hungary, indeed, Orbán also kind of cultivated a certain segment of the political spectrum to become anti-European and anti-EU. But he knows when to unleash the dogs and when not to unleash the dogs. This can be and must be kind of part of the analysis, to some extent the speculation, but I think the critical issue is slightly differently placed. The problem is that the next year's election campaign is not going to be fought around a single vision of the European Union. If you ask the Polish people, I think for the Poles, the European Union was helpful because it helped them develop infrastructure, but in the next 10 years, it's going to be helpful if it helps them protecting against Russia. Right, so it's to protect the eastern border. But if you ask the French people will find the European Union useful if it helps them, preventing, the fall into a vassal status vis-à-vis the United States. It's a completely different preoccupation than countries in the eastern flank of the European Union, and probably Germany is somehow torn in between. And that's why there is this big debate about the vision and the mission of the European integration. The current German coalition, as we know, started with a vision of an openness to a deeper integration. Even the F word appeared occasionally, federal. That's what I mean.
You read the recent speech of Olaf Scholz, our Chancellor?
Yes, I followed the Strasbourg speech, indeed, in the European Parliament, and a lot of people tried to compare it to his Prague speech. So obviously there is also an evolution of the German government position, but indeed a very keen interest in both deepening and enlarging the European Union, which
the old motto of the 90s, deepening, any enlargement follows a deepening, and so on and so forth. It was the old discussion,
Yes, so in my view, there is an effort to restore all this, but then you cannot evade the security question. Right? So now we are so much overwhelmed by the war and the consequences of the war that one way or another there has to be an answer to this. But at the same time, we have to resist securitizing everything. Because, just by saying that, okay, security is so paramount that we can forget about health, social questions, employment, inflation, monetary stability, and so on and so forth, then obviously this would be a recipe to lose the confidence of the European citizens.
So we have 1 minute and 30 left, and so it's probably the last question. If you had one wish, what we do to get back to an ambition of a social Europe and politically united Europe? I mean, what the citizens want, this sort of citizens. There is an initiative which is called #Citizens Take Over Europe, so #CTOE, and they are sitting in the internet every Wednesday and basically working on a European Citizens Assembly and writing a European Constitution. So there's a lot of bottom-up European civil society making in these days, and it's quite interesting to observe this. And I always say, look, we have a European IBAN number, so why shouldn't we have a European social security number, so that the sort of the economy and the social sort of match on level of the numbers? There's one European social security number. What would be your trick, your thing to say within now and the European elections? We have one motto, one thing to get back on track for European social political Europe.
I would mention something which popped up already in the previous elections, and it would be perhaps counterintuitive. We haven't mentioned this so far, which is the question of housing, and and it's very interesting because you need to be bold to put this into the EU agenda, because obviously this is not an EU competence defined by the law. Nevertheless, if you look at the citizens' expectations, which comes through in municipal, national, but also the European elections, I think people's housing conditions have deteriorated so much, despite European prosperity and everything, that this could be a potentially a breakthrough if you get it right. Various aspects have already been highlighted, whether it is about the qualitative aspects and sustainability, which Ursula von der Leyen tried to package into this concept of the new European Bauhaus. I don't know if the listeners have heard about this, but there are many other aspects. The financial.
Can I interrupt you? The Bauhaus was one of I wrote the Bauhaus in my little book, Why Europe Should Become a Republic, in 2016, and there's the Bauhaus idea in terms of architecture in the book. So
oh dear. So maybe
sometimes
Frau
I
von der
feel
Leyen.
Yeah, we
Von der
don't
Leyen
know.
has read your book.
We don't know. I just wanted to mention. I had the Bauhaus
Or
before
McKinsey.
her.
McKinsey
Or
wrote.
McKinsey. The McKinsey guys, I think, they don't reason or think about Bauhaus, don't they? I mean, they're not so much into aesthetics, right?
You never know.
But sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I think you asked me to put forward one idea which deserves more attention than previously.
Housing.
And I would agree that housing is definitely one, and that would be a challenge, of course. But the EU should be able to face up to the challenge. So somehow you should be inspired by Mariana Mazzucato, who several times recommended the European leaders to identify what would be the so-called moonshot, right? A great ambition which, if you concentrate the resources and the policies, you can deliver. And that can be, curing dementia, for example, which is probably possible, right? But you need to concentrate resources.
No, I see, and I'm a taker. I remember a conference in Austria, in Vienna, 2 years ago or so, where the housing question popped up, and where trade unionists were basically saying that the real estate, there must be an impact of the European Union, because these tremendous real estate, the cost of housing in cities like Barcelona, Paris, Frankfurt, where ordinary people can no longer live, like a policeman or a teacher can no longer afford real estate prices and so on and so forth. Yes. So there must be a sort of European regulation. And if we remember that the last euro and banking crisis started with a real estate and housing crisis, I think it's really a very tough issue to be handled perhaps by the European Union in some smart regulation, so that the social question here can be met. Anyway, we are coming to an end. At least we are coming to an end of the English recording with László Andor. And I'm very thankful. I think we tried to give you a panorama about 10 or 15 years of European ambitions in social policy. I hope you like this recording. I hope you will go back to the publications of László Andor to read more. And we hope we have the ambition that this podcast will trigger you something in the uprun of the European elections, and that the social question of Europe will turn you on, and you will dig deeper in this. Okay, so László, many thanks for this one.
Thank you for inviting.
I'm a citizen of Europe.
Sono cittadina europea.
Ich bin europäischer Bürger.
Jam europeană.
Európai polgár vagyok.
Eu sou europeia. Jag är en medborgare i Europa.
Ja sam europeanka.
Yo soy ciudadana del continente europeo.
Jestem european.
Sunt europiete.
Sunt cetățean al Europei.
Ja grażdanka Europei.
Ja громадянка Європи. Sunt europiete.
Moi, je suis un citoyen européen.